Where I grew up, we were surrounded by the woods. Not isolated for sure, my neighbors were all within walking distance, or yelling distance. A couple 100 feet from the main road and the highway, but you'd have to walk the woods for that. At night, there's always strange sounds, nothing to look into too hard. A sound like a screaming child is just the mountain lion that my neighbor 3 doors down shot while it was attacking his chickens. The ominous low rumbles were just the bucks shedding the itchy coverings from their antlers. They always used the trees close to my house. There are also plenty of raccoons and opossums roaming about, so when I started hearing rustling outside at night I didn't really question it. We lived in a 2-story ranch-style house, living on the bottom floor and bedrooms on the top floor. My parents got the room to the right of the stairs with a view of the road, and I got the room with the view of the backyard and tree line. The way my house was built, it featured a staircase that led into the backyard, accessible from inside by a door in my room. Under these stairs is where we kept our trash bin and recycling. That's also incidentally where the rustling began. The first time I actually looked out the window in the door to check it was when my friends, let's call them H and J, were over. We were young then, ranging from J's 5 years to my 7 years. Having a late-night playdate because H and J were going to their grandmother's for 2 weeks with their parents soon and I wanted to see them before that. We had been setting up a tower of books to be a Barbie house. We didn't have enough money to afford one of those fancy ones so we made do. The rustling began halfway through, books stacked nearly over my head, and being used to it, I paid it no mind. H, however, crept to the door and opened the curtains, presumably just for a peek, and immediately gasped, then dropped to the ground. Startled, Jay knocked over the tower of books, sending them crashing to the floor. I remember skittering away to avoid being crushed by my dinosaur encyclopedia, the first book holding up the stack, when H said, "He's out there." Frustrated by the books falling over, I had turned on H and stood to go to the door. "Who?" I asked, about to pull the curtain aside, but H stopped me, and that was the first time I noticed how scared they really were. "There's a tall scary man at the bottom of the steps." I remember the fear spiking down my spine, exactly how it felt. At this time, my father worked late-night shifts, and my mother was watching us, but she was in the kitchen making food. I could hear her. I wanted H to be pranking me so bad that I peeled back the curtain despite their pleas. I wish I hadn't. There was a man, and he was tall, probably 6 feet 5 inches, I would know because that's how tall my uncle was, and I'd seen him stand where the man was. He stood at the very foot of the steps, wearing a top hat and all dark clothing. I couldn't see his eyes because of the brim, but I could see his mouth. He was smiling, but he looked like he had no lips, and his smile was eerie. It stretched too far towards his ears, and I could see all too many of his teeth and gums. I slammed the curtain shut and screamed for my mother. By the time she got upstairs the man was gone, and she told us to come have dinner before bed, that clearly we must be overtired. We barely slept that night, all 3 of us huddled under my bed with blankets packed under the edges to seal it. I remember hearing dawn approach and then the overtiredness took me. The second time I saw him, my curtains weren't on my door. I was 8 years old then and had almost forgotten him. My dog had chewed my curtains so they needed to be replaced, so I'd let my mom take them for the night. I'd been getting ready for bed when I'd heard the rustling, and peeked out my window for the heck of it, hoping to see the cute fat raccoon that had been hanging around. I did see the raccoon, except he was hanging limply from the smiling man's mouth. Blood surrounded his smile, and this time I could see his eyes. They were open and crazed, like Cruella de Vil's from 101 Dalmatians when she's driving her car really fast. I couldn't help it, this time I screamed for my mom first thing, nearly hyperventilating as I watched him start to step up my stairs. 1 stair, 2 stairs, 3 stairs. My mother burst into my room and I whipped my head around, hysterically trying to tell her what I saw. The man was gone, however. My mother for sure thought I was crazy. I had her put up my curtains right then and there, torn or not. The next morning my dad found the dead raccoon and blamed my dog for it. I knew better. The third and final time I had seen him had been 2 nights before we moved. I was 11 years old. I hadn't forgotten about him, but with no sightings in the recent years, I'd gotten bold with leaving my curtains open. This time I had been sat on my bed reading, Percy Jackson, I think it was, the 5th book. I heard rustling, but assumed it was the wind, as this night we had high wind speeds, a storm rolling in from somewhere. I'd lifted my head because something suddenly didn't feel right, and there he was, standing at my window. He looked all shadow, but that smile, that face was pressed to my window. I hadn't screamed, too shocked to even move. He had always been at the bottom of my steps. When the door handle rattled, I'd finally sprung into action, and leaving my book, I ran downstairs to get my father. He'd ran back up with me, but the man was gone, once again. I supposed because he had done something different this time, he'd still be there. We moved shortly after, and though I miss it sometimes, I will never miss seeing him. The man at the bottom of my stairs. Ever since I was a child, I'd experienced episodes of sleep paralysis. It always felt like there was an evil presence in the room, taunting me, waiting for me to succumb to fear. Yet, I always knew it was just a trick of the mind. Sleep paralysis, they say, is just your brain caught between the states of wakefulness and sleep. But that was before the faceless creature. My first encounter with it was an otherwise ordinary night. I awoke, unable to move, my eyes fixed on the corner of my bedroom where I saw a tall, unnaturally slender figure with elongated limbs. The creature's skin was as dark as the night itself, and it had no face, just a blank, smooth surface where the features should have been. As I lay there, paralyzed with fear, the creature's face transformed, taking on the visage of my best friend Mark. It was him, down to the last detail, but there was something deeply unsettling about it, as if his face had been stretched to fit over the creature's. It approached my bed slowly, methodically, and took a seat on the edge, its weight barely causing a dent in the mattress. Wearing Mark's face, it started recounting a memory from our childhood when we had ventured into the woods behind our houses. We had stumbled upon a dead animal, its carcass mutilated and unrecognizable. In reality, we had quickly retreated, shaken by the gruesome sight. But the creature's version was twisted, reveling in the gore, describing the scent and texture of the blood and flesh, while wearing Mark's face with a sinister smile. A few nights later, the creature returned, this time taking on the face of my older brother, Tom. It slithered closer to me, retelling the story of the car accident that had left Tom with a permanent limp. But instead of recounting the truth, that we were both grateful to have survived the wreck, it warped the narrative, making it sound as though Tom resented me for walking away unscathed. It whispered how Tom secretly wished I had suffered just as much, if not more than him. The pain in its eyes was so real, so palpable, that I couldn't help but question the authenticity of my own memories. The encounters with the faceless creature became more sinister as time went on. It took on the faces of everyone I loved, always focusing on our darkest moments together. It reveled in the emotional turmoil it caused, wearing a twisted grin as it recounted disturbing versions of my memories. One particularly harrowing night, the creature appeared wearing the face of my first love, Emily. Its eyes, once filled with warmth and affection, now stared coldly at me, recounting the intimate moments we had shared, twisting them into something perverse and unsettling. It described the way her heart had raced, not from passion, but from fear and repulsion. When it took on the face of my closest friend, Sarah, it spoke of a long-forgotten argument between us, imbuing it with a newfound sense of betrayal and malice. The creature, wearing Sarah's tear-streaked face, described how I had broken her trust and left her feeling abandoned, sowing doubt about the sincerity of our friendship. It didn't stop at my family and friends. The creature appeared with the faces of teachers, co-workers, and acquaintances, each time recounting a moment in my life when I had failed or been vulnerable, amplifying my shame and guilt until it was all-consuming. One night, the creature appeared wearing my mother's face. As I lay there, paralyzed, it described, in vivid detail, a gruesome and violent end to my family, reveling in their suffering as if it were a beautifully crafted work of art. The words, spoken in my mother's sweet, gentle voice, pierced my soul, leaving me to choke back sobs of despair. Each encounter left me more shattered than the last, my sense of reality slipping away as the faceless creatures' distorted tales wormed their way into my memories. I no longer knew who I could trust or if I could even trust myself. I sought help from therapists and doctors, but nothing they said or prescribed could keep the creature at bay. My life had become a living nightmare, and the line between reality and the terrifying world created by the faceless creature was becoming dangerously blurred. As the torment continued, my relationships with my loved ones deteriorated, as I couldn't help but see the faceless creature's twisted visage in their faces, hear its sinister voice in their laughter. The world around me became cold and unfamiliar, a reflection of the darkness that had taken hold of my mind. Desperate for an escape from the living nightmare that my life had become, I isolated myself, hoping to starve the creature of the connections it needed to continue tormenting me. But it only grew stronger, more relentless in its pursuit to consume my every waking and dreaming moment. One fateful night, as the creature sat on the edge of my bed, wearing the face of my sister, it whispered something that shook me to the core, "Why don't you join us?" The words echoed in my mind, and I felt a sudden urge to surrender to the creature, to embrace the darkness it represented. I fought against the impulse, but the seed of an idea had been planted, and it began to take root. I watched in horror as my life crumbled around me, my relationship strained by my erratic behavior and the chilling darkness that now consumed my every thought. I found myself increasingly drawn to the idea of joining the faceless creature, of letting go of the torment and becoming one with the very thing that had ruined my life. In the end, I couldn't resist the pull. I gave in to the creature's sinister proposition, and as I embraced the darkness, the creature's face took on my own. The horrifying truth was now clear: the faceless creature had always been a part of me, feeding on my fears and insecurities, growing stronger as I weakened. And now, I had become the monster, ready to spread my own darkness to others, forever trapped in a sinister cycle of fear and despair. For generations, tales of the forest have resonated with the locals. Its tangled woods, shadowy depths, and eerie stillness bred a sense of unease among the townsfolk, who avoided the area at all costs. Growing up, I heard countless stories about the forest. How people would venture in and never return, their voices added to the whispers that haunt the trees. Others spoke of apparitions seen in the night, lost souls searching for escape. As I grew older, I was determined to investigate the truth of the forest for myself. It was a crisp October evening, and the sun had just begun to set. The sky was painted with shades of deep red and orange as the moon slowly rose, casting an eerie glow over the forest. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a healthy dose of skepticism, I approached the tree line. The moment I entered the forest, I could feel a change in the atmosphere. The air seemed colder, thicker, as if I was wading through a mist that clung to my skin. Despite the wind rustling the leaves above, the forest floor was eerily still. My skepticism slowly turned to unease as the forest seemed to close in around me. With every step, I could feel eyes watching me, following my movements. In the distance, I began to hear faint whispers echoing through the trees. At first, I dismissed them as the wind playing tricks, but they soon grew louder and more distinct. I couldn't quite make out what they were saying, but the voices carried an unmistakable sense of dread. Unable to resist the pull of the whispers, I ventured deeper into the woods. As I followed the voices, I noticed that the trees seemed to grow more twisted and contorted the further I went, their gnarled branches reaching out like desperate hands. The whispers grew louder and more frantic, filling my head with a cacophony of terrified voices. Eventually, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an ancient tree, massive and gnarled, its bark blackened and withered. The air around it seemed charged with an unnatural energy, and the whispers reached a fevered pitch. I could finally make out what they were saying. "Leave. Don't come any closer. Turn back." I hesitated, torn between curiosity and self-preservation. But the pull of the voices was too strong to resist. I approached the tree and, almost in a trance, placed my hand on its twisted trunk. The voices suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. As I stared at the tree, it seemed to beckon me, urging me to discover its secrets. As I studied the tree, I noticed a small, hidden opening at the base of the trunk. It appeared to lead into a tunnel that twisted downward into darkness. My curiosity overwhelmed my fear, and I knew I had to explore it. I pulled out my flashlight and squeezed into the narrow tunnel. As I descended, the whispers returned, their voices a mix of terror and pain. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, the darkness pressing in around me, until finally, it opened up into a vast underground chamber. The room was lit by a faint, eerie glow, revealing countless human remains. Bones littered the floor, their bleached white surfaces etched with strange symbols. In the center of the chamber, a massive stone altar stood, covered in dried blood and surrounded by tattered remnants of clothing. As I took in the horrifying scene, the whispers grew louder and more urgent. A deep sense of dread filled my chest as I realized the truth of the legend. These lost souls were the victims of the Whispering Forest, drawn in by its sinister call, never to return. Suddenly, a bone-chilling scream echoed through the chamber, the sound resonating in my very bones. The ground beneath me began to shake violently, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow me whole. Panicked, I scrambled back toward the tunnel, my flashlight flickering and casting ominous shadows on the walls. The voices grew louder, more insistent, urging me to flee for my life. As I climbed back up the tunnel, the earth continued to tremble, and I could hear the forest above me groaning and splintering under the strain. I clawed my way out of the tunnel, and as soon as my feet hit the forest floor, I sprinted away from the clearing, the voices propelling me forward. As I ran, I could feel the forest collapsing behind me, the trees uprooting and crashing to the ground, as if trying to bury the horrors beneath. The whispers grew fainter, the voices choked with terror, until finally, they were drowned out by the sounds of the forest's destruction. Exhausted and terrified, I broke free from the tree line and collapsed onto the damp grass. Behind me, the whispering forest lay in ruins, its dark secrets buried beneath the earth, never to be discovered again. The townsfolk never spoke of the forest after that night. The ruins were left to be reclaimed by nature, and over time, the whispers faded from memory. But every so often, when the wind blows just right, you can still hear their voices, echoes of the lost souls, forever bound to the whispering forest. And I, who once sought the truth behind the legend, am left with a haunting reminder of my brush with the darkness that lurks in the heart of the forest. I carry the burden of the whispers with me, a secret etched deep in my soul, never to be forgotten. Things have happened in the past year. My job cut down on my hours, causing me to suddenly have spare time. Since I was hired into a full-time position right out of high school, I assumed I needed to walk into places to hand out resumes. I quickly found out that nearly all of the applications were online only. I must have filled out at least 100 applications in the time it would have taken me to drive to 3 different workplaces I'd been interested in. It became a waiting game. I started to grow restless. I'd worked a full-time job for 10 years. I needed a hobby until I got a second job. Around that time, I accidentally got into hiking. I knew of some local trails but never had the time to explore them. Some friends of mine invited me on one of their outings, and I agreed. We had such a fun trip I found myself wanting to go out more often. Even after I picked up a part-time job, I started walking the trails whenever I could. I loved just hiking and seeing the new sights of the national park I'd neglected to visit. I often put my earbuds in just to get into a good audiobook for hours on my days off. In the middle of summer, my set of friends planned a small weekend getaway. I couldn't afford to go with them. They suggested we do a hike the day before they left and for us to meet at the start of a trail none of us had taken yet. According to them, there were some nice caves hidden away along the path. I felt excited seeing something new. I packed my bag and set off on my way to the meeting spot. I worried about the weather on that day. It rained hard the night before. The summer weather brought some nasty storms on and off for most of the season. The sky was bright, so I carried on. I got a bit turned around on the trails trying to find the right one. I also needed to rest a few times more than I normally do due to the elevation of the trails. I've kept to the easier trails, so I hadn't been fully ready for this hike. With the sun cooking my skin, I carried on hoping all of this was worth it. I made a few mistakes on that trip. Mistakes that nearly cost me my life. First, I got lost. I hiked up a high trail that ended in a cliff. I stopped to wonder where I got turned around. I slipped my bag off my back to drink some water and get out my phone. The signal wasn't great, but I took a photo to send to my friends asking if they knew where I ended up. I assumed I would be getting a message back shortly mocking how lost I'd gotten. I expected them to have sent me some texts by now saying how late I was. My second mistake was that I got very close to the edge of the cliff to take that photo. I wasn't afraid of heights, and I should have been. My third mistake was I didn't put my phone away or put my bag back on right away. When the dirt and rocks crumbled under my feet, I dropped my phone trying to grab a hold of anything that might keep me from falling. My fingers caught the dusty rough cliff side as I fell, causing some of my nails to break or get outright torn off. Within half a second, I found myself rolling down the cliff, my body getting beaten from the fall. My bag got hooked on a branch and I heard a pop from my shoulder when all my weight was supported on the strap for a few painful seconds. My arm slipped out and I started falling again. It was a miracle I didn't die from the fall. My body knocked some rocks loose. They came tumbling down after me. I sometimes wonder if it would have been better if I died on the way down. Nothing but pain and fear waited for me at the bottom of that cliff. I got knocked out for an unknown amount of time. At least I landed on my back. My entire body hurt. I couldn't sit up for a long time. I just mentally cursed myself for being so stupid. The relief of being alive faded the moment I saw how bad my situation looked. My foot and ankle hurt like crazy. I managed to sit up and my body turned cold. The rocks that rolled after me had landed on my foot, pining it to the ground. I forced myself to lean over, trying to dig at the ground to get it free, but found it impossible. I landed on solid rocky ground. My foot was most likely broken and pinned between literally a rock and a hard place. No matter how much I struggled, it wouldn't budge. I nearly passed out from pain the first time I moved my ankle trying to pull it free. I acted slower after the first failed attempt to try and figure out just how screwed I was. I wasn't sure if I sent that text to my friends or not. I looked around not seeing my bag or my phone. There was a good chance my phone was in a million pieces on the side of the cliff. With some effort, I saw my bag tangled up on the cliff. It was brown, so it blended with the cliff side. I kept cursing as I thought about what to do. If my friends didn't hear from me, they would call the park rangers, right? I just needed to wait for someone to find me. But how long would that even take? Hours? Days? I started to shake at the grim outlook. I wanted to just scream until someone found me. No matter how tempting, I refused to lose my cool. If I panicked, I could hurt myself. I didn't have any food or water. Conserving my energy was ideal. I hated myself for not looking up any survival tips before I started hiking. It was only just walking around. How dangerous could it be? How could anyone be so dumb? I regretted a lot of choices that lead me to that moment. With my head swimming, I just laid back down. I used my arm to block out the sun from my eyes, silently praying someone would find me soon. I did let myself cry for a little while on the first day. I needed to get it out of my system. Hours passed without any sign of help arriving. My leg wasn't looking great. Someone needed to show up soon or else I risked dying from an infection. I noticed some blood seep from under the rock, but I couldn't do anything about it. Unable to do much else after the sunset, I let myself fall into an uneasy sleep. My body was so exhausted I passed out despite how hard and uncomfortable the ground felt. A smell caused me to open my eyes at the crack of dawn. The light low and gray. Turning my head, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat twice. First, my water bottle had been placed right next to my head. I grabbed it not thinking about why or how it got there. I took a few sips forcing myself to not drink the entire thing. Then I focused on what woke me up. The sight caused my heart to nearly stop. A few steps away from me was a pile of something that took me a few seconds to clue in. A heap of small dead birds with their heads twisted off sat already starting to rot. I gagged but kept my water down. My stomach hurt from hunger and then twisted from nausea. My head started to swim with fear. Who killed so many birds and why did they put them next to me? How did I not wake up to the sound of someone moving around? And why didn't they help get my foot free? I had too many questions and no answers. I almost considered an animal of some sort killed the birds, but an animal would not have brought my water bottle over. My fear would not go down. Someone had been there that night. Instead of helping they left a strange warning. Was it a warning? If so, why leave some water? Did they drug or mess with my bottle in some way? The sun came up giving me enough light to look around for footprints or any signs of another person from the night before. My heart sank when I didn't see my bag caught on the cliffside. Someone had definitely taken it. Unable to help myself, I screamed out for help with only a slight echo answering back. I'd spent the second day making no progress in freeing my foot. I wasted some water trying to see if it might make the rock slippery enough to pull my ankle free. At least it was cloudy that day. By the end of the day, my exposed skin was red. If it wasn't so cloudy, I would have had some serious burns by then. My throat hurt from thirst and my stomach twisted from the smell of the dead birds that cooked in the sun all day. I thought people could live a few days without water, but in the direct sunlight, I would sweat out what I had drank. An infection from my broken and cut-up foot might not be fast enough to kill me before dehydration did. I fell into an uneasy sleep a few hours after sunset. My entire body was in pain and my hope slowly fading. To keep sane, I kept thinking of the food I wanted to eat once I got back home. If I was rescued, I wanted to eat an entire cheesecake. Maybe two. The simple goal was enough to ease my nerves to fall asleep. That night I found out who left the dead birds. A small noise woke me. I reached over in the dark to my water bottle for a small sip and to my shock found it full. It also felt cold. I drank down the fresh water not caring about how it got there. I needed to live first, then worry about who refilled it and yet didn't fully rescue me. The sound that woke me came again. I'd completely forgotten about it because of the fresh water. I sat up to try and find the source of the sound. At first, I thought my mind was just playing tricks on me. Then, a soft voice came. "Hey." The single word faintly echoed through the rocky area. My mouth opened to respond but I froze when my eyes landed on the source of the sound. A dark shape sat on a branch of a tree in the distance. It looked like a person wearing a furred poncho sitting like a frog. The hood of their handmade coat over their head made their face look pitch black. What nearly gave me a heart attack was a set of glowing red eyes set in that dark face. "He." The voice came again from the person. No, it wasn't a person. After looking at them for a bit longer I noticed the exposed dark arms looked too long and thin. The hands with extremely long fingers tipped with claws. It might be saying a single word, but that didn't make it human. The voice was almost normal and sounded lazy. I tugged at my foot trying to get it free. I could not be out here with this thing watching me. A flash of pain went right up my leg. I moved my ankle in a bad way. The pain was almost enough to make me pass out. I got dizzy and needed to go back down. My body shook from so many emotions and stress. That single word came, almost sounding concerned. Hey. I refused to respond to it. Unable to help myself, I passed out again. I prayed that what I saw watching me had only been a nightmare. I woke up again a little after sunrise. My strength fading from being outside in the elements for so long. At least the pile of dead birds was taken away. A single dead rabbit in their place. Next to my newly refilled water bottle sat something that would have been useful if it wasn't broken. My cell phone broke into a few pieces on the way down the cliff. Each piece had been neatly organized together. I no longer could pretend that creature was a nightmare. Something watched me in the night trying to be useful in its own way. Something scratched my arm when I moved, so I turned my head to find a branch with some leaves still attached. I wondered what that was doing there. When the sun came up, I figured it out. I was able to stick the branch in a crack in the ground and hide under the small bit of shade it provided. My already sunburned arms hurt like hell. My face stung from sweat and burns. I couldn't stop myself from drinking the entire bottle of water that day. My stomach hurt like hell from only drinking the past 2 days. A fever set in from an infection on that day. I didn't have much longer, I knew that. I needed a knife or a sharp rock to free myself in the most gruesome way possible. I considered if I could even cut off my foot. I could just die from blood loss in the process. If I died, at least I wouldn't need to be stuck in this heat. Near the end of the day, thunder signaled a storm rolling in. At first, I felt happy about the rain. The storm clouds blocked out the sun and a downpour started. Soon I became soaked, the hard wind cutting down right to my bones. I shivered on the cold hard ground, unable to do anything. I didn't even have the strength to make another attempt to free my foot. I went in and out of sleep for a few hours. My fever growing due to the rain. My eyes cracked open in the dark. My chest was so heavy I could barely breathe. The sound I didn't want to hear came, but it was far too close. Hey! I lifted my head to see the creature from the night before sitting on my chest. The glowing red eyes squinted in a smile. I saw dark teeth shining in the night. Too many teeth for that face. My mouth opened to respond, but I found my tongue too heavy. The thing reached out a long arm to take my water bottle. With some issues, it twisted off the lid. With one large hand, it lifted my head enough to let me drink. Most of the water spilled out around my mouth and I coughed hard for a few minutes. The fever tore through my body and my skin burnt to hell. Even the pain of my broken foot took the backseat to a pounding headache. I wondered why this creature was keeping me hydrated and yet it didn't try to get my foot free. The thing got on all fours over top of my body to slowly shuffle back. Those red eyes never left my own. It stopped with its head by my thigh. The head sideways, and large smile clear in the dark. A large hand landed on my knee, causing a wave of pain to shoot through up to my brain. I knew what this thing was asking. We didn't need to speak the same language to understand each other. It still spoke one last time to confirm the request. Hee-yee-yee-yee. The mouth hovering over my thigh, the other hand wrapping around my upper leg. My choices were to die in the next few hours from an infection and exposure or give in to this monster's demand. I braced myself the best I could. With a trembling heartbeat, I nodded. Okay. I said in a cracked voice, giving permission. The thing let out a happy sound. The mouth opened so wide it nearly reached the monster's hidden ears. Countless needle-thin teeth quickly came down on my leg, ripping through my jeans and into the flesh underneath. I screamed but didn't have the strength to fight it. I only stayed awake to see the second bite. The pain shut off my brain and I thankfully fell into a dark nothingness I expected to never wake from. But I did wake up. Weak but alive, my eyes opened to a hospital room. The recovery took a very long time. I was told I had been found in a strange way. A pair of hikers had been going down a trail when they saw an oddly shaped figure drag my body into the middle of the path and then run off into the woods. They never caught up to the figure, and after seeing my condition focused on getting me help. I was missing my entire left leg. The doctors had no idea how I survived it being removed in my condition. They said I should have died from the shock and blood loss. They all said it looked as if some sort of animal chewed it off. I told the police what happened the best I was able. Turns out when I didn't meet my friends, they just assumed I got busy and forgot to send them a message saying I wasn't going to meet them that day. They then went on the trip, so no one realized I was missing. At least my job sent the police by my place as a wellness check when I didn't show up for a shift. They were in the process of starting a missing person report when I was found. They didn't believe I saw a creature, and I admitted to them I didn't want to believe it either. The stress may have made me see things. The police assumed if I did see someone, then it would have been some person living in the mountains messing with me. But that didn't explain my leg. They shrugged that off, saying some sort of animal got to it and the person who found me did the right thing by getting me to a place where I would be found. The police knew some unhinged people lived in the woods. They thought I got lucky to make it home alive. And they recommend I get better friends. I keep thinking back to that night. The missing leg is a constant reminder. I know it wasn't some sort of natural animal that took my leg. There is a creature humans haven't unidentified yet living in those woods. I can only hope others don't make the same mistakes I did. If you are going out in the national parks, please be careful. Make sure people are aware of where you're going and when you'll be back. Stick to trails you know well and pack an emergency kit to always keep with you. Nature is something not to be taken lightly. I was stupid and paid the price. As helpful as that creature acted, I really don't want it to get another meal from a human. Just be careful out there. As soon as my husband, kids, and I moved into our new home, I knew that something was off. It was an old mansion, with high ceilings, grand rooms, and creaky floors. It had character, and it was perfect for our growing family. But there was something that felt wrong. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I felt like we weren't alone. It was as if there was someone watching us, someone just out of sight. I tried to brush it off, thinking that it was just my imagination, but things started happening that I couldn't ignore. One day, while I was putting away some books in the library, I noticed that one of the bookshelves was a little loose. When I pushed it, it gave way, revealing a small room hidden behind it. At first, I thought it was just a storage room, but when I went inside, I felt a chill run down my spine. The room was small, with no windows and only a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was a bed, a dresser, and a small desk with a chair. It looked like someone had been living there, but there was no sign of anyone. That's when I started hearing things. At first, it was just whispers, like someone was talking softly in the next room. But then, I started hearing footsteps, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the room. I didn't tell my husband about it at first, thinking that he would just think I was crazy. But then, he started noticing things too. Objects in the house would move on their own, as if someone was playing a prank on us. Doors would open and close, and sometimes, we could hear someone breathing in the next room. We started doing some research on the history of the house, and that's when we found out about the girl. Her name was Lily, and she had lived in the house many years ago. She was the daughter of the previous owner, and she had been locked in that room and forgotten by her family. We started piecing together the events that had led to Lily's imprisonment. It turned out that she had been caught sneaking out of the house to meet her boyfriend, and her parents had been furious. They had locked her in that room as punishment, and had simply forgotten about her. She had died in there, alone and scared. As we learned more about Lily's story, the haunting became more intense. We would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of her crying, or we would find objects in the house arranged in strange patterns. We tried to communicate with her, leaving notes and toys in the room for her to play with. Sometimes, we would even hear her giggling in response. But there was something else in the house, something darker. We started noticing shadows moving in the corners of our vision, and we could feel a sense of dread whenever we were alone in the house. We knew that there was something else in there with us, something that didn't want us there. One day, we decided to call in a paranormal investigator to see if they could help us. They brought in all sorts of equipment, from EMF detectors to infrared cameras. They spent hours in the house, and when they emerged, they had a grave look on their faces. According to the investigator, there was not just one spirit in the house, but many. They were all drawn to Lily's room, and they seemed to be protecting her in some way. But there was one spirit that was different from the others. It was a malevolent entity that was feeding off of the fear and negative energy in the house. It had been awakened by our presence, and it was growing stronger by the day. The investigator warned us that we needed to leave the house immediately, but we couldn't just abandon it. We had put so much into it, and we couldn't just leave it to the spirits. So we decided to fight back. We brought in a priest to bless the house, and we started doing our own research into how to banish spirits. We tried everything from sage smudging to salt lines, but nothing seemed to work. Then, one day, we stumbled upon an old book in the library. It was a book on the occult, with spells and incantations that we couldn't understand. But there was one page that caught our eye. It was a page on banishing spirits, and it had a drawing of a sigil. We didn't know what the sigil meant, but we decided to try it anyway. We drew it on a piece of paper and burned it, reciting the words on the page. At first, nothing happened. But then, we felt a rush of cold air in the room. The whispers and footsteps stopped, and we could feel the malevolent entity growing weaker. We continued to do the banishing ritual every day, and slowly but surely, the spirit started to leave. The shadows stopped moving, and the objects stopped moving on their own. We could finally sleep at night, without the sound of crying and footsteps keeping us awake. After a few weeks, the house felt normal again. It was as if the spirits had never been there at all. We were finally able to live our lives without the fear of the unknown. But sometimes, when we're in the library, we can still feel a chill run down our spines. We can feel the presence of Lily, watching us from the room behind the bookshelf. But we couldn't shake off the feeling that something was still off. Even though the malevolent entity was gone, there was still a sense of unease in the house. One day, while we were cleaning out the basement, we found an old box hidden in the corner. Inside the box, we found a journal belonging to Lily. As we read through the journal, we realized that Lily had been communicating with the spirits all along. She had made a pact with the malevolent entity, offering it our souls in exchange for her own protection. We had unknowingly been living in a house that was haunted by Lily's own doing. And now, we realized that we were trapped in the house forever, with no hope of ever escaping. The spirits had claimed us as their own, and we were doomed to spend the rest of our lives in a never-ending cycle of fear and terror. The banishing ritual had only worked temporarily, and now the spirits were stronger than ever before. We had made a grave mistake by thinking that we could fight back against the unknown. In the end, it was our own ignorance that led to our downfall. As we sat in the living room, surrounded by the whispers and footsteps of the spirits, we knew that we had no way out. We were doomed to spend eternity in this haunted house, with no hope of ever finding peace. I've lived near these woods all my life, and I would always hear tales about this house deep in the woods. These were just tales, but my mom always warned my siblings and I to avoid the woods. I can understand the more logical reason for this. There are countless animals in the woods, but my mother would always warn us to beware of the house in the woods. Naturally, my siblings and I didn't really heed her warnings. In fact, we wanted to find this supposed house. No matter how hard we searched, we couldn't find it, so we eventually gave up on it. A few months ago, I went to visit my parents who still live in the same house my siblings and I grew up in. By this point, I had completely forgotten about the tales of the house in the woods. 3 days into my visit and my parents' dog, Charlie, went missing. It's normal for Charlie to wander around in the woods, but he would always come back home an hour or two before sunset. When he didn't arrive home an hour after he normally would, my parents began worrying. I assured them that he'll probably show up within the next hour. Another hour flew by and no sign of Charlie. By this point, my parents were worried sick. They'd had Charlie for a long time and loved him to death. I was also concerned for him, but I knew it was dangerous to go looking for him at night. I told my parents I'd search for him first thing tomorrow morning, which helped calm them down. We had all been fast asleep when the sound of barking woke me. Realizing the barking sounded like Charlie, I rushed out the house with a baseball bat and my phone. I shined my phone light into the woods and saw a glimpse of white fur. "Charlie! Come here, boy!" I called out. Instead of running to me, he ran farther into the woods. I hesitated only a second before running after him. It was a miracle I was able to just barely see him with the flashlight. I ran for what felt like hours before I noticed a clearing up ahead. Charlie disappeared right before my eyes as he entered the clearing. "What the fuck?" I said, shocked. It was then that I noticed something much stranger. In the clearing, stood a 2-story Victorian-style house. The tales of the house in the woods rung throughout my head. How did I find it? No, how is it still in good condition? The house was clearly old and there wasn't a single sign of human life, but it looked pristine. There was no moss growing on it, nor was the paint bleached. Not even the porch had dirt on it. I marveled at the sight, taking it in slowly. The house looked completely fine, but there was this weird, eerie feeling in the air. It sent shivers down my spine, but I decided to investigate the house. After all, this was the house of those tales, the same house my siblings and I spent most of our childhood trying to find. I hurriedly walked onto the porch and to the door. I knocked on it despite the fact that there was clearly no one here other than me. I held my breath for a second in fear that someone might actually respond. After getting no response, I carefully opened the door. Like I expected, the inside was in pristine condition as well. I placed the bat I had brought with me down beside the door before searching the first floor. I soon realized that the house appeared as if someone still lived in it. I instinctively pulled my phone out and began taking pictures of the different rooms on the first floor. After I got a sufficient amount of pictures of the first floor, I moved up to the second floor. This floor had many bedrooms, each room looking as if someone lived in them. I took multiple pictures of these rooms as well. One bedroom still had messed up bed covers as if someone had just gotten out of them. The bedroom drew my attention the most. I looked around at the different paintings, photographs, and jewelry. "May I help you?" a voice said behind me. I jumped out of fright and turned around. I was met with a woman, dressed in a Victorian-style dress. I calmed my racing heart before responding. "I'm sorry, I thought no one lived here." She laughed. "I'm not surprised. I do live out in the middle of nowhere. It's late, but are you hungry?" As soon as she asked, my stomach growled in response. She chuckled, "Follow me." So do you live here by yourself?" I asked as I followed behind her. "No, my husband and I live here together. He is off in town tonight, he'll be back in the morning," she answered. I eyed her suspiciously. No logical explanation could explain why she was living in a house in the middle of the woods. A house that is in perfect condition, and not to mention she looks like she walked straight out of one of the portraits I saw. As we walked down the stairs, the smell of food hit me. It made my stomach growl louder in response, but I couldn't help the unease I felt. I had only been in the house for at most 15 minutes, how could food already be prepared? I had been on the first floor for a good 9 minutes, and besides I didn't smell food when I first opened the door. I shook my head, maybe I was just being paranoid. We made it to the dining room where the table was already set for two. The food looked as delicious as it smelled and I could hardly wait to dig in. We took a moment of silence to pray before we ate. I quickly dug into the food, I hadn't realized I was so hungry. "This is delicious, Mrs. What's your name?" I said. "Mrs. Preston, please call me Mrs. Preston." "I'm flattered you find my food so delicious," she replied with a smile. Her smile sent chills down my spine despite it looking so nice. I mentally shook my head, it's just my nerves. "Aren't you going to eat?" I asked, pointing to her food. She chuckled, "I will, let me go get something first." As soon as she left, I realized I wasn't as hungry as I thought. In fact, I felt nauseous. I set my utensils down and stood up. I walked around the dining room for a bit before stopping short in front of a portrait. In the portrait was Mrs. Preston, and the frame had the words, "In loving memory of Elise Preston, 1826 to 1850, carved in it." I froze immediately as my stomach turned sickeningly. "She's dead." "What are you doing?" Her voice sounded behind me. I quickly turned around. I was just walking around a bit to make more room for the food. It's really delicious, it'd be a shame to waste it." "Oh, wonderful," she said cheerfully. I breathed a sigh of relief and looked over at the clock on the wall. "Oh, would you look at the time, I'd better head home." "Thank you for the food." Her face fell as the room became much colder. The room quickly went from pristine condition to a very poor state. I looked at the worn-down table, and the plates of food. My eyes widened as bile raised in my throat. I hunched over and threw up the contents in my stomach. It was horrible, the food was decomposed and there were maggots and other insects on it. I continuously threw up, even when my stomach was empty. Her shrill laughter echoed throughout the room. "Oh, it's been so long since I last had a decent meal. A young man like you would be the perfect appetizer." I raised my head and saw her grotesque form. She was a dark grayish color, her hair was but a few strands, she was decomposed in many areas. In some places I could see her bones and other places consisted of insects. The sight made me dry heave. "What's wrong, darling? Don't like what you see?" "No matter, you'll soon be in bliss," she continued as she lunged for me. I fell backwards, just barely escaping her clutches. One of her fingernails, however, sliced me and it cut deep into my skin. It burned like a knife and continuously bled. I scrambled to my feet and rushed to the door. I felt the floorboard give away and my leg fell through. I shouted in pain as a piece of the broken floorboard penetrated my thigh. I struggled to get my leg out but it was no use. Elise was already in front of me. She said nothing as she grabbed me by the collar and pulled me up before tossing me across the room. I slammed against the wall and nearly blacked out from the collision. I struggled up and ran for the door once more. "Do you seriously think you can escape me?" she laughed sinisterly. She was on me in an instant and had me face down on the floor. She dug her decayed claws into my back. I yelled in pain once more as tears fell from my eyes. I felt her lean down, her mouth against my neck. "I'll be sure to enjoy you thoroughly." I closed my eyes as I tried to struggle against her, but it was no use. I felt her teeth on my neck and in a boost of adrenaline I was able to shake her off. I crawled to the front door and grasped at my bat I had left there. She grabbed my leg and pulled me back towards her. I turned over and swung the bat hard. It knocked her down and she shrieked. "How dare you do that?" I struggled up and didn't hesitate. I swung the bat down continuously, pulverizing her decomposed flesh. A dark substance splattered onto me, but I paid no mind and continued hitting her. I didn't stop until she had stopped moving. I was breathing heavily and leaned against the bat for support. I caught my breath and then made my way out of the house. I turned around to get one last glimpse at the house. It now looked like a typical rundown house. It didn't look anything like it did previously. I looked to the sky and noticed it was getting light again. I had been there the whole night, but it only felt like a few minutes. I walked slowly, each step filled with pain. My vision continuously dimmed as the forest around me began to come to life with the sun. Finally, I made it out and stumbled to my parents' house. I tried calling out to them, but it came out as a hoarse whisper. I reached the door and fell against it heavily. I tried to catch my breath with no luck. I heard the sound of footsteps and then the shouts of my parents as my vision went completely black. I later woke up in the hospital, hooked up to IVs. My blurry vision just barely made out my parents' relieved faces. I slightly smiled before the events that happened flashed through my head. It made my stomach churn as I leaned over the bed and dry heaved in the trash can. After that, I was visited by doctors who continuously observed my condition. I tried to tell them what happened, but they all agreed that the stress from the situation caused my brain to misremember it. It didn't help when I tried to show them pictures of the house, but an error showed instead. They did however have multiple questions for the puncture wounds I had gotten from Elisa's claws. Naturally, I explained to them what happened, but they found it hard to believe. Even though it was difficult to believe, the gouges in my back were proof I got attacked by a person. They held me in the hospital while they treated the infection that the wounds had caused. This information was given over to the police who had begun searching the woods for the house. It wasn't long after this that I was discharged from the hospital with medicine to take for my injuries. After some searching, the police still hadn't found the house in the clearing. It was then that I offered to show them where it was since I wanted to prove to everyone it really existed. After much hesitation, they agreed. And so, we entered the forest. Despite not really remembering the path I had taken when I followed what I believed to be Charlie, I instinctively knew where to go. It was like something was drawing me back to the house. Some time later, I spotted an all too familiar clearing up ahead. "This should be it up ahead," I called out. We reached the clearing and there stood the house, in pristine condition once more. "See? That's the house with the lady in it," I said. The officers looked at me strangely before one spoke up, "Son, all we see is a very run-down and fallen-apart home." I looked from them to the house in shock. How could they not see it? It's very clearly in good condition. Why was I the only one who could see the house in pristine condition? "Look, we will inspect the place if you want, but you most likely fell through the second floor. There wouldn't be anybody living here," he continued. I nodded and watched as all but one entered the house. After a few minutes they came out. Their faces told me all I needed to know. There wasn't anything there. I reluctantly conceded and we headed back. I left the clearing before a chill ran down my spine. I stopped and turned around. On the porch, waving at me, was Elise. Her sinister smile sent shivers down my spine and made me sick to my stomach. I quickly turned away and followed after the officers. After this, I bid farewell to my parents and quickly went back to my home. I wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. Despite what everyone has told me, I know that what happened to me is real. The events of that night have been seared into my mind to the point I can't comfortably sleep at night. I've been having nightmares of what happened ever since. It's because of this that I have come here to search for answers. Does anyone know what happened to me? What is Elise? How come I was the only one who could see the house in pristine condition? Why were the pictures I had taken of it gone? If anyone has any clues, please let me know. Also, a word of advice to everyone: don't mindlessly enter a house in the woods. You might get more than what you bargained for. Have you ever experienced mirrorception? You know, when you put two mirrors together and the reflections just keep going and going, like an endless loop of your own image. As a kid, I was always fascinated by this phenomenon, but my parents' bathroom with its two identical sides opposite each other only allowed me to see a limited number of reflections before my own body blocked the center. But today, I finally had the chance to satisfy my curiosity. I constructed a contraption with two mirrors facing each other, placed a lamp above them to provide adequate lighting, and cut a small hole in the center, to place my phone camera behind. Initially it was cool, but the center was still blocked off. I then set up my higher quality camera to capture the images and used a one-way mirror instead to look into the infinite reflection. As I zoomed in on the images, I couldn't help but feel like I was peering into a portal that stretched out into infinity. The reflections slowly became clearer and clearer, but the further they got, the darker they appeared. In the center, I noticed a small black square that looked like a tiny dot. I was about to turn off the camera when a thought occurred to me: what if I just let it keep recording? Maybe I could edit the footage and create something that would go viral on the internet. That night, I went to bed feeling content with my work. However, I was abruptly awakened by a feeling of intense heat and choking on thick smoke. As I sat up, I could see the flicker of flames in the darkness, and the smell of burning plastic filled the air. Panic set in, and I scrambled out of bed and made my way to the living room. To my horror, the entire room was ablaze. The TV screen flickered wildly as it burned, and the smell was overpowering. I was frozen in shock for a minute before I finally snapped out of it and began gathering my most valuable possessions. Once outside, I dialed the emergency services and waited in a daze as the fire was put out. Afterward, I assumed that the camera had been responsible for the fire. It must have overheated during its prolonged recording and caught on fire. The guilt and regret of my recklessness weighed heavily on my mind. Days later, as the smoke removal experts cleaned up the aftermath, I decided to review the footage from that night. As I watched the images on the screen, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something was off about the video. It wasn't just the fire, there was something else, something strange lurking in the reflection. As I scrutinized the footage, my heart began to race. Suddenly, I noticed something that hadn't been there before: a figure standing in the center of the black square. The figure was so blurry that it was difficult to make out, but its presence was undeniable. As I continued to watch, the figure grew clearer and clearer, until it was standing directly in front of the camera, its eyes fixed on me. I sat there in horror. I know it couldn't actually see me, but I was still terrified. "This can't be real," I repeated in my mind. I scratched my head, noticing that the figure repeated that movement. I waved my hand around, and dropped the camera in shock. The figure had been repeating my every move, just like a mirror. It had to be some coincidence, or a prank, or I was hallucinating. I slowly picked up the camera. The mirrors around the figure looked like they were melting. Liquefying, but not entirely dripping down, just getting bouncier. I noticed as more figures splashed through, the camera getting completely covered by the mirror liquid. The audio for the camera was this ghastly gurgling sound. It felt like it was haunting my ears. I wanted to put the camera down, but I was just too horrified. I could only sit and listen, staring at the distorted screen as I heard the demonic sounds, and a crackling, which I assumed to be the fire starting. That was when I had enough. I stopped watching and put the camera down. I was too shocked to understand what to do, and that night I wasn't able to sleep until pretty late, my mind filled with the scenery of the footage. When I got home, I destroyed what remained of the contraption and erased the footage, knowing that I couldn't ever bring myself to peer into that endless reflection again. I've been super weary around any mirrors for a while, although it's been pretty silent since then. But the memory of what I had seen still haunts me to this day, and I can't help but wonder what other dark secrets lurk in the depths of the infinite portals. Sometimes, I still think I hear a gurgling echoing through my house in the depths of the night. About a couple years before COVID lockdowns, my wife used to have a weird work schedule where she worked most Saturdays, so our weekends were kind of split. I only mention COVID above because that is when her weird schedule changed and she didn't have the weird schedule anymore. So whenever there was a Saturday or Sunday where I was home alone with our son who was about 7 at the time this event happened, I used to take him on little adventures. One time we found a book that was made by a historical society to promote kids into visiting little unknown museums in our state. This book had a lot of places I have never even heard, and I have lived here my entire life. I am also an older dad, on average about 8 to 10 years older than most dads in my son age range. I only mention that because I am not really one of those dads who will do a lot of theme parks and that kind of stuff. I actually don't like crowds or waiting in line, and I attribute that to me being an old dad. I do love history, so when we got that book about the little-known museums in the state, we set out to try and visit nearly every one. My son always loved our adventures together because we would say it was boys' day out. I guess that was to make him feel okay that mommy wasn't joining us. Anyway, sorry for the rambling, but here goes the heart of the story. One day we picked a museum that had to do with a family who settled the area and became wealthy due to oil, but also suffered lots of deaths and hardships. That morning I made us breakfast, and then we put on comfortable clothing and shoes and packed some snacks for the road. We arrived to the museum, and to be honest, it wasn't at all what I was expecting. The area was surrounded by massive complexes of industrial buildings, but hidden way back was this pretty big tract of open land that had a museum, a gift shop, a cemetery, and a bunch of older buildings and the grand house. We paid the donation for the house and grounds tour, and it had a bunch of old farm equipment, and the kind of typical museum object that were all from shortly after the Civil War to the turn of the century, the 1800s to 1900s. We were in a group of all adults, and my son was the only kid on the tour. Most of the people were actually older than me. There was a group of Asian family, not sure where they were from, but they didn't speak English, but they all seemed really nice and enjoy seeing the Old West stuff. There was another family who looked like siblings and a mom, an older middle-aged couple, and a few single people in our tour. Everything was going fine, no issues. As we were doing the grounds tour, talking about old farm life and ranch life, the tour guide was talking about all the cattle and how the original deed had land going all the way out past the freeway and almost out towards the next county over, so the original family land was very vast and probably very lonely to the original settling family. As soon as we entered the main house, one of the ladies who was with us started acting like she was having a fit. She looked really normal, about in her mid-40s. If I had to describe her, I would say PTA president looking. From what I remembered, she stayed back by the entry door and did her best not to make a scene. When we moved from that entryway to the main parlor, she seemed like she was starting to cry in a silent whimper, and then she started shaking. It didn't look like she was having a medical emergency, but it looked like if she just found out someone had died or something. She looked like a split from extreme sadness to scared as she was shaking, and she started to look really pale. Finally another lady said, "Are you okay?" and she blurted out, "I need to get out of here." The tour guide stopped the tour and said, "Ma'am, I can't let you out alone, nor can I leave the tour alone, so everyone in the tour is going to have to follow me to let you out." We all were like, yeah, of course. Everyone had concern for her. As we leave the house and make our way to the parking lot and to the locked gate, I noticed her color came back and she started looking better. She exited the gate, and just right outside there was a bench, and she sat there and started to cry. Our tour guide went to check on her and asked if she needed them to call 911. She said no, but she didn't know what came over her, and she never had a reaction like that before. The tour guide had actually said, "Well, you're not the first one to have a reaction to the house, but please check in with the museum if you need water or if you want to sit inside for a bit." The lady said, "No, I'm fine, I am going to go home." The tour guide came back in the gates and apologized to us for not allowing us to stay in the house alone. As she was talking, I saw the lady get up from the bench and fast walk, almost like in a fear, back to her car. It was like if it was midnight and she was in a dark parking lot, kind of a rush back to her car. Eventually we all returned to the house, and go into the parlor. It was a formal sitting area with old 1800s furniture and a pistol in a case over the mantel. One of the guys on the tour had asked the question that I am sure it was in all our minds. "What did you mean when you said that she wasn't the first one to have a reaction inside the house?" That is when the tour took a dark side. apparently back in the late 1800s the owner of the land who had inherited the land and stock from his father, almost lost everything due to bad deals, bad management and loss of cattle. One evening there was a knock at the door we had entered. It was bankers, a judge and sheriff or something like that. Well, they had come to call the outstanding loans, and of course he didn't have the money to pay it back, so he had to deed large tracts of his family land over to the banks to repay the loans. Shortly after midnight the gentleman left and rode out. Suddenly there was a shot heard, and the landowner had sat in the very chair in the parlor and put the very gun that hung over the mantel to his head and killed himself. His body was laid to rest in the family cemetery just outside the main house and adjacent to the parking lot. The tour guide also said about a decade later, when the landowner's son took over the family land, that oil was discovered on the property and on mostly the property that still belonged to the family, so they went from almost losing the family land to later generations becoming very wealthy again. She also mentioned that during Halloween they do ghost tours and then stop talking about the house being haunted. I think mostly due to the fact that my son was with us, however he wasn't paying attention and was busy looking at other things. At almost the end of the tour, just as we were outside the house and around the back, my son looks over at the house and points to the window and says, "What's that?" I look, and so did everyone else. Nothing was in the window. I asked him, "What did you see?" and he just walked away. He freaked out everyone and we all went back to the parking lot, and my son and I went to the gift shop. I tried to ask him again what he saw and he just said, "I think it was a pet." I didn't want to freak him out, so we just bought some old-time candy and went home. I didn't know anything about the house or grounds prior to the visit and didn't know it was supposed to be haunted.